Hey everybody, Johnny here. Most of the time you're only working with one blend file, so rendering and re-rendering inside of that file isn't that big a deal. But other times you may run into situations where you have multiple files that you want to render out all at the same time. Or maybe you've made a tweak to some library or material and you want to render all of the images that use it across all of your files. But you don't want to have to go to every file to make these changes. Or you want to do a preview render from each of those files without going to each of those files to do the render. Well, if we use Blender, Python, and some batch files, we can save ourselves a lot of time. Now this tutorial will be specifically using Windows, as that's the system I'm using Blender on, and this type of scripting on Mac or Linux looks a bit different, and I don't want to lead you astray there. So let's get into what our setup is. Keeping things simple, I've created this model of a box, and I'm going to use it as a linked library. So out of my model1.blend file, I've created some more files. Output 1, where I've changed the panels to red, Output 2, where I've changed the panels to blue, and Output 3, where I've changed them to this chrome material. Now obviously, if in real life our scenes were this simple, we would just do this in one file. But for the sake of argument, let's say these things are split up into separate files, that for either size or complexity reasons, we have kept separate. How can we go about rendering all three of these unattended at the same time? What we'll want to do is create a Windows batch file. If you're not familiar with a Windows batch file, it's simply a plain text file that has a list of commands for the operating system to execute one after another. To create one, I just need a plain text editor. I could use the text editor in Blender, I could use the Windows Notepad program, I could use something like Notepad++. In my case, I'm going to use Visual Studio Code. I like Visual Studio Code because it has a lot of syntax highlighting, among other things, that just make life easier. Just the only thing to look out for is don't use something like WordPad or Microsoft Word, because these programs don't generate plain text files. They generate formatted text files, and you don't want that. If you are looking at doing any coding and you haven't used Visual Studio Code before, I'd recommend downloading it and trying it out. It really has become my favorite text editor for development. For now, I'm just going to create a new file, and VS Code will ask what type you want. In this case, I want a bat file. VS Code will also ask me where I want to put it. This is the folder where my blend files live. There's output 1, 2, and 3. For this first file, we just want to render the three files all at once. So I'm going to call this one renderall.bat. You'll want to add the .bat because that tells Windows that this is a batch file, and it should execute its contents. The next thing we'll need is the path to Blender. This can be a little tricky, as it depends on how you installed Blender. If you used the Windows installer that you downloaded from blender.org, you should be able to find it by opening up your File Explorer, going to your C drive, Program Files, Blender Foundation, and then choosing the version of Blender that you want to use that you have installed. In this case, I'll choose 3.2. Once you've found the folder that contains blender.exe, you're in the right spot. If you've installed Blender by simply downloading a zip file and unzipping it to a location on your hard drive, you'll want to navigate to that location. Once you've found blender.exe, go up to the path and click on the folder. This will turn the path into its actual text path name. Highlight this and press Ctrl+C to copy. Then go back to your text file. Press Ctrl+V to paste, and then add \blender.exe. You're also going to want to surround this in double quotes. The reason for the double quotes is that our path has spaces in it, and we don't want Windows to misinterpret those. So this turns this whole piece into the executable that will be run to get started. If we were to save this and then run this batch file, Blender would open as normal. However, for our purposes, we don't want Blender to load up its graphical interface. We want it to quietly do the rendering by itself. In order to do that, we'll add a switch. So after blender.exe, quotation mark, we'll add a space and type in -b for background. This means that Blender will open in a headless mode, and so there won't be any GUI created. After that, we need to tell it which file to load up. The three files that we want to render are output1, 2, and 3.blend. So I'll start with output1.blend. So after Blender has started, in the background, it will load output1.blend. At this point, we need to tell Blender to render our file. If we want to render all of the frames in our animation, we type in -A for render animation. Or if we want to render a single frame, we do -F for render frame, and then we give it the frame number we want to render. Now, if we navigate to the folder that contains these files, and we double-click on our renderall.bat, if we then go to our default :/TMP folder, we'll see that we have frame 1 rendered from our output1 blend file. So now that we're able to render one frame, we can simply copy this line and paste it 2 more times, changing the file name from output1 to output2 and 3. Now, back in my folder with my renderall.bat, I'll go ahead and double-click it again. Now that that's complete, let's go back to our TMP folder. We still only have one file, but now you'll notice that it's the third file that we have, the one with the chrome sides. Why is this? It's because in each one of these files, frame number 1 has been rendered as 001.png. Then the second file did the same thing and overwrote it. Then file 3 did it again and overwrote it again. So obviously there's something else we have to do here. We need to be able to set the output file. We can do that with the switch -O. So before my -F, I'll add -O and then the path that I want it to go to. If you put in something like /TMP, that's going to put it at :/TMP. However, if you'd like to render it to a location that's relative to the location of the blend file, you can use double slashes here. So //TMP/ will put that file in a subfolder of our current folder named TMP. However, the output is still going to be 0001.png. Well, we can also add the beginning of the file name that we want. So in this case, we'll call it output1_. So this will create a subfolder under my current blend files folder called TMP, and then start its file with output1_, and then fill in the rest with the frame number. Let's copy and paste this to the other 2 lines. And change the names. We'll save that and go back to our folder. And let's run our render again. The TMP folder was created, and if we jump into it, we'll see that we have output1 0001, output2 0001, and output3 0001. This is exactly what we were hoping for. So now, anytime I want to create these renders, I can simply run this batch file to create them. So if I go back into my model file, and I make an adjustment to my model. So if I want to re-render all of them at the same time, I can just run my renderall.bat file. Now if I go back to my temp folder, you'll see that all 3 of my renders have the new library change implemented, and I didn't have to go to each one to do the render. But now let's say those renders take way too long, and you're wanting to do a more iterative process. So you think that doing preview renders of all of them will save you a lot of time. You could go into each file, change the output settings, save them, and then render each one of them, and then when you're done, go back and change them all back to 100%. That would certainly work. However, let's do this in a more scripted way. Let's open output1.blend. Let's say for my preview renders that I wanted to reduce my resolution percentage, and I wanted to change the minimum noise threshold for the cycles renderer. The first thing I'll do is I'll go over to my scripting tab and create a new script. Whenever we create a new Blender script, we start it with the words import bpy. This imports the Blender API into Python. Next, we want to change the render percentage. The first thing we can do to try to find out how to do this is to simply change it, and then look over here in the info output window. You'll notice a command here, bpy.context.scene.render.resolution percentage = 40. I'm going to copy this command by highlighting it and pressing Ctrl C, going over to my script tab and pressing Ctrl V. If I take this and change the 40 to something like 50, and then run my script, you'll see that my resolution size changes. So this is the proper command to change the render size resolution. Let's say for our previews, we only want to render at 25%. Next, we wanted to change the noise threshold. If we come down to our render noise threshold and change it to say something like 0.1, you'll see bpy.context.scene.cycles.adaptive threshold equals 0.1. We'll take that, paste it up here. Let's change it to something like 0.5 and run this script. Again, you'll notice that the noise threshold changed to 0.5. So this script is doing exactly what we wanted it to do. For our previews, I think that 0.25 is going to be fine. Next, we'll want to save this out as a Python file, separate from our Blender file. So we go to the text menu and go to Save As. In the folder containing our blend files, we're going to save this as setpreview.py. And then we want to make sure that our file is back to the way we want it. So I'm just going to go ahead and revert this file. Our render resolution is back up to 100%, and our noise threshold is back to 0.05. And out in our folder, we've got setpreview.py. Let's go back over to our batch file. Since now we want to be able to render previews, we're going to take our batch file and save a copy of it. So we'll save this as renderallpreview.bat. We still have the path to Blender, which is great. We want it to run in the background and open up our blend files. We want the outputs to be set individually, and we want them all to render frame 1. But before we render, we want to execute our script. To execute the script before we render, we'll put in a -P switch. -P runs a Python file, so we need to give it the name of the file we just created, which was setpreview.py. This will run the script that we created in that blend file, which will change the settings and then do the render. Now we'll copy this command to our other two lines. Saving that, we'll go back to our folder and run our renderallpreview.bat. We can see that the dimensions of our files are 480 by 270, which is the 25% we asked for. But let's go back and open up output1.blend. You'll see that in output1.blend, our percentage is still 100% and our noise threshold is still 0.05. That's because after we ran the script and rendered the file, we didn't actually save our blend file, so none of those Python script changes actually get saved into our files. So this is great for doing temporary preview renders from a batch of files without having to manually go back and reset those changes. But what about the times where instead of rendering, you just want to change a setting on all of your files? Like say you had 25 files and you wanted to change the maximum cycles samples in all of the files and save it without having to open up every single file. Let's go ahead and do that. If we go back to our scripting tab, click New and import BPY, we'll change our samples here, say to 2000. We'll grab the command from the info window. We'll make a change here and run it just to make sure the changes happen. Okay, so that's what we want. Now, if this is all we did, we'd be doing the exact same thing we did before, changing the setting, but never saving it. If we want to save it, we'll need to add that command to our script as well. If we go up to File and click Save, you'll see that what gets added to the info window is not overly helpful. It doesn't give us the Python information, but there is another way to find that. If we go to the Edit menu and Preferences, under the Interface tab, turn on Python Tooltips. Now, if you go to the File menu and hover over Save, you'll see in the pop-up window a Python command, bpy.ops.wm.save main file. This is the command that you'll need to add to your script to run the save command. So now, if I change this to something like 4000 and run my script, you'll see that my max samples change to 4000, and if I go and revert the file, that my max samples is still 4000. So this has saved those changes to my file. I'm going to go ahead and save this Python script out, We'll call it set samples. We'll go back to our text editor and save this. We'll call it setsamples.bat. Now this time, we don't want to actually render out these files, we just want to change the samples. So what I'll do here is remove -F1 so that it won't render. I'll also remove -O in the file output because we don't need to change the file output right now. And now we'll change the script name to setsamples.py. Now if I go back to my folder and run setsamples.bat, and we open up output 3, we'll see that the samples are now saved as 4000. So quite literally, anything that you would want to do with Python inside of your blend file that you need to do to multiple blend files all at the same time, you can script like this in a batch file and have it run on all of them very quickly and easily. So again, if you're only working with a handful of files, this may or may not save you any time. However, once you get up in the teens or 20s of files and you need to make a global change to all of your files, this might be a better way to go, especially if you think you're going to be making changes to those files quite often. Or you want to do some temporary changes and render them out to see how they look without actually changing your files yet. I know this tutorial doesn't really apply to everyone, but I hope you can find some usefulness in it, and I hope for some of you it saves you boatloads of time. So anyway, as always, I hope this inspires you to make something awesome, and I hope it saves you some frustration. So until next time, I'll catch you later.